Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca Jahor, and today we're going to be covering a presentation that I've made for you, Breaking Boundaries, the Power of the Inuit Oral History in Uncovering the Franklin Expedition. Today we're diving into a fascinating story, one that's been told and retold for generations, not through books, but through voices. We're talking about the Lost Franklin Expedition, a mystery that has captivated historians, explorers, and the Inuit people whose knowledge has helped piece together what really happened. But here's the question. Why was this knowledge ignored for so long? How does oral history, passed down from one generation to the next, differ from oral testimony, recorded and interpreted by outsiders? And how have colonial perspectives shaped what we consider credible history? Through Inuit oral accounts, historical analysis, and a fresh look at the Franklin search, we're going to explore how knowledge survives across generations and what we can learn when we truly listen. Let's get started. Well, we begin with looking at the difference between oral history and oral testimony. Before we dive deeper into the Franklin expedition, we need to make an important distinction: oral history versus oral testimony. At first glance, they might seem like the same thing, but they serve very different roles in preserving knowledge. Oral history is a living, evolving tradition. Stories passed down through generations, shaped by culture, memory, and shared experience. For the Inuit, these weren't just tales. They were essential knowledge for survival and understanding the land. Oral testimony, on the other hand, is often extracted from a specific moment, recorded in response to an outsider's question. It's shaped by context, by who's asking, and by what they expect to hear. Think about how the 19th century explorers approached Inuit informants. Were they looking for a rich cultural history? No, they wanted direct answers. Where did the ships go? What happened to the men? This difference is crucial when we examine Inuit accounts of Franklin's men. Many Western historians dismiss these stories because they didn't fit the right frigid framework of testimony. They were seen as legends rather than evidence. But as we see, Inuit oral history contains truths that took over a century for Western researchers to recognize. Let's move on and hear some of these powerful accounts. Inuit oral histories of the Franklin expedition. Now let's step into the Arctic, the 1840s, where the Franklin expedition meets its tragic fate. For years, the story of what happened to the Franklin's men were clouded in mystery. European search parties scoured the Arctic for clues. But the Inuit already had answers. Through oral history they passed down for generations. They preserved chilling first-hand accounts of what they saw. One well-documented account comes from Inuit hunters near King William's Island, who described encounters with the starving, desperate men. They saw small groups of Europeans struggling across the ice, some of them dying where they fell. Some men had resorted to cannibalism, an observation later confirmed by forensic analysis of the bones found in the region. Then, there's the story of Terror Bay, where the Inuit spoke of a massive ship trapped in the ice. They described men abandoning the vessel, some making it to shore, others perishing along the way. This was dismissed by Western historians until 2016, when the wreck of the HMS Terror was discovered in exactly the place Inuit oral tradition had described. Another fascinating site is Havik, meaning the place having metal. Inuit stories tell of scavenging European tools and supplies left behind by the Franklin expedition. Metal from corroded cans, pieces of wood, even nails. These were repurposed into tools for hunting and survival. Some researchers, like David Woodman, have argued that sites like the Havik contained vital clues about Franklin's lost men and their movements. These stories were told over a century, yet dismissed by Western historians who prioritized written records over oral history. The question is why? What biases shaped the way Inuit knowledge was received? Let's explore that next. The impact of colonization on interpretation. Imagine standing before someone who's told the answers you desperately seek, who knows where the lost men went, where the abandoned ships lie, and where the final traces of an expedition remain. Now imagine ignoring them. Not because their knowledge is lacking, but because it comes from a different tradition. That's exactly what happened when European explorers and historians dismantled Inuit oral histories of the Franklin expedition. Why? Because colonialism wasn't just about land, it was about controlling knowledge. It was about deciding whose version of history mattered and whose didn't. For centuries, when Western explorers and scholars viewed the Inuit as primitive, as mere survivors of the Arctic, not experts in it, they saw their oral traditions as an unreliable folklore rather than valid historical evidence. When the Inuit described seeing emancipated white men stumbling through ice, these accounts were labeled as exaggerations. When they told of ships trapped near Kings William Island, they were ignored. Let's take Charles Francis Hall as an example in the 1860s. He was one of the few European searchers who actually listened to Inuit oral histories. He recorded stories from elders who remembered their ancestors encountering some of Franklin's men, some dead, some barely alive. These accounts detailed signs of starvation, abandoned camps, and even cannibalism, something at the time and still continuing today as being very taboo within Inuit culture. But when Hall shared these findings, they were met with skepticism from the British establishment, which preferred heroic tales of exploration over grim realities. They couldn't believe that, potentially, their men had resorted to cannibalism. Another case is John Ray's discovery in 1954. He found physical evidence that Franklin's men had resorted to cannibalism, just as the Inuit had described. The reaction? Outrage. The British elite, including the famous author Charles Dickens, refused to believe such a thing could happen. They claimed the Inuit must have made it up, or it even had killed the Franklin's men themselves. The truth was dismantled because it challenged the idealized image of the noble British explorers. But this wasn't about facts. It was about power. Western historians prioritize written records over oral knowledge, dismantling Indigenous testimony as uncivilized. Inuit knowledge wasn't just ignored, it was actively discredited. And yet, when modern archaeology finally caught up, what did they find? The wrecks of the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, discovered precisely where the Inuit had said they were. Bones with cut marks, proving cannibalism, exactly as the oral history described. The Inuit had been telling the truth all along. So if they were right, why did it take over a century for the world to listen? That brings us to our next point. How the ideas of otherness shaped the way Inuit knowledge was received. Otherness, and the changing perception of Inuit knowledge. Why were the Inuit stories dismissed for so long? The answer lies in a concept we call otherness, the way dominant cultures view those who are different as outsiders, as people whose knowledge and experiences don't carry the same weight. For European explorers in the 19th century, Inuit weren't seen as historians or reliable witnesses. They were seen as a part of the landscape, people who simply existed in the Arctic, not the stewards and the experts who understood its complexities. This mindset shaped the way Inuit knowledge was received, or rather, ignored. Take the Franklin search efforts for an example. Dozens of British and American expeditions were launched, spending millions of pounds and decades of search for answers that the Inuit already had. In 1869, an Inuit named Inuktitut talked to Charles Francis Hall about a ship trapped in the ice and later sinking near an island. The details matched what would exactly be confirmed about the Erebus. But at the time, very few took it seriously. When the explorers did listen, they often misunderstood what they had heard. Inuit oral tradition is rich with metaphor, symbolism, and context, elements that Western searchers frequently missed. David Woodman, one of the first modern researchers to seriously analyze Inuit accounts, noted that mainly early European listeners took Inuit words literally, rather than understanding their deeper meaning. For example, when the Inuit described Franklin's men as eating each other, many assumed this was a reference to cannibalism. But Some Inuit meant it metaphorically, describing desperate men who turned against each other. But the tide has begun to shift. In recent years, researchers have finally started to acknowledge the value of oral history. The discovery of Urbus and Terror in 2014 and 2016, exactly where Inuit stories placed them, was a turning point. Parks Canada archaeologists worked alongside Inuit communities, using their knowledge to guide underwater searches. Instead of dismissing oral traditions, modern explorers now rely on them. This change represents something much bigger than the Franklin expedition. It's a shift in how we understand history itself. By recognizing oral history as a legitimate source, we move beyond colonial mindset that only written records hold truth. The past is not just what is written in books, it's also what's spoken, remembered, and passed down through generations. Now let's take a look at how these ideas connect with the broader themes of our course readings. Now that we've explored how Inuit oral histories provided key details about Franklin's fate, details that were ignored for over a century, let's connect this to the broader themes of our course readings. One major distinction we've discussed in the difference between oral history and oral testimony. In the encounters on the passage, Inuit meet the explorers, we see is oral history is collective, passed down through generations, while oral testimony is a personal account given by an eyewitness. The Inuit stories about Franklin's men were often a mix of both. Some were first-hand encounters like those recorded by Francis Hall through journals, while others were oral histories preserved over time. But because these accounts didn't follow the rigid structure of European written records, they were often dismissed. Traditionally, Indigenous oral history and oral accounts were not recognized as factual resources because they were not written down language like other British common examples were. So at the time, they couldn't be perceived as intellectual, intelligent, or even scholarly, and, realistically, helpful. These individuals did not listen to the accounts Indigenous Inuit individuals were giving to the explorers onto where they could find the details around the men. This ties into a second key thing, how colonialism shaped which histories were considered valid. In Nunavut, Inuit regained control of their lands and their lives. We see how colonial powers imposed European ways of knowing on Indigenous peoples, often rejecting oral traditions in favor of written records. The Franklin search exemplifies this. Millions of pounds were spent on search expeditions, while Inuit testimonies, which already contain accurate information, were brushed aside. This wasn't about a lack of knowledge. It was about whose voices were given authority. A third theme we can draw on comes from In Order to Live Untroubled, which discusses how Inuit communities adapted to changing environments and incorporated European materials into their lives. For example, a two-eyed seeing incorporates of innovation. This is evident in the Franklin case as well. Sites like Havik Talik, the place having metal, show how Inuit scavenged abandoned expedition materials, repurposing nails, copper, and tools for their own use. These weren't just discarded scraps. Inuit saw the value in these materials and integrated them into their survival strategies. This highlights the adaptability and innovation and resourcefulness of the Inuit, in contrast to Franklin's men, who, despite having advanced technology, heavy amounts of food, shelter in form of supplies, failed to survive in the Arctic. Finally, our readings also empathize the impact of otherness on historical interpretation. Franklin and his men were romanticized as tragic heroes, while the Inuit, who actually witnessed their final days, were viewed as unreliable or even deceptive. These mirrors on how colonial narratives often erase Indigenous perspectives, reinforcing European superiority. But as we've seen, modern archaeology has validated Inuit accounts, proving that oral histories were not only reliable but essential in uncovering the truth. So, what do these connections tell us? Do they reveal that history is not just about written records? It's about power, perspective, and whose voices are heard. Inuit oral histories preserve knowledge that Western explorers overlooked, and today we're finally seeing a shift in how this knowledge is valued. As we move on to our final slide, let's reflect on why this matters, not just for understanding Franklin's fate, but for the rethinking on how we approach history itself. Reflection on the role of oral history today. As we reflect on the role of oral history today, it's clear that Inuit accounts of Franklin's expedition aren't just historical anecdotes. They're an essential part of how we understand the past, and they continue to reshape the way we think about history. The shift in how we view oral history has come a long way from the days when Inuit knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Today, researchers actively seek out and validate oral traditions, recognizing them as crucial complement to written records. The Inuit were right all along. Their stories passed down through generations provided us with insight that Western explorers and historians overlooked for a century. One person who helped break the colonial stereotypes and the challenges was the dismissive attitude towards Indigenous knowledge was Charles Francis Hall. Hall stands out as not just an explorer, but as someone who recognized the value of oral history. While much of his work during his exploration focused on collecting written reports or examining physical artifacts, Hall listened and worked with the Inuit. He was one of the first to take their oral traditions seriously, recognizing that the Inuit had knowledge about Franklin's expedition that no one else had, and even the examples of what happened to the Franklin's expedition men after their perishing, locations where Hall could find remnants of the men's journey, and the locations of the ships as well. Hall's work was groundbreaking in that he bridged two worlds, the European search for Franklin and the Inuit oral tradition. But what's the most important is how Hall helped shift the narratives. Hall painted a picture for the British Empire of not only these people that were occupying the lands, but a smart generation of Inuit people who were building technology like snow glasses and tools and having the advancement and the sustainability to be able to understand Arctic situations and Arctic climate and food sources, and even hold almost a mental geographic map of the area to be able to direct explorers to certain situations and to showcase their hunting grounds and such. Before Hall's efforts, Inuit were often portrayed as passive, uninformed, or even hostile to European explorers. Hall's recognition of their knowledge helped challenge these stereotypes. Like we saw throughout the images shown in the collection of Inuit explorer diaries, we saw an example of the fact many explorers were trying to showcase the Canadian Arctic as an area of nothing, of a barren area of resources and fish. And when they had even the opportunity or even made the choice to showcase Inuit individuals, they were looking to oppress them as an archaic group that was lucky to be of survival in the Arctic, and not all their amazing efforts they had put in to understand the land around them. And that's the reason why they brought so much success compared to the explorers that perished along the routes. Hall validated the Inuit as knowledgeable experts on their land, capable of providing essential information that Western explorers couldn't even begin to uncover. Today, we see the results of this change. Oral history is now understood as a valuable tool for reconstructing the past, not just for Indigenous communities, but for all of us. Researchers and archaeologists now collaborate with Indigenous communities, relying on oral traditions to guide their work. The discovery of Franklin's ships, the Erebus and the Terror, was only possible because of Inuit knowledge. This is a testament to the power of oral history, and we, how as a society, have begun to recognize the importance importance of these voices that were once silenced. Look ahead. We have an opportunity to continue this path of reconciliation and validation and value. We must keep learning from Indigenous knowledge systems, respecting their role in shaping our traditions of history, and ensuring that Indigenous voices remain central in the conversation about the past, present, and future. In closing, the story of Franklin's expedition is more than just a historical puzzle. It's a reminder of the importance of listening, of recognizing knowledge that comes from different traditions, and of understanding that history is richer when we honor all voices. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Rebecca Jahor, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.